Has all the recent talk about UFOs and government programs gotten you wondering what it would be like when we contact these other planets? Well, Federation is looking to answer that question. Sort of. It's year 2442, and you're leading a delegation of ambassadors to make the case to become the 6th member of a 5-planet federation. You will use your ambassadors to increase influence across other planets, also to go on the Galactic Senate floor and pass laws, as well as fund different projects. This all comes packaged in a multi-dimensional worker placement mechanism that we're going to dive into, and I think is really interesting and what makes this game unique and definitely worth checking out. The game's for 2 to 4 players, plays in 60 to 120 minutes, depending on the player count. At its core, it's a worker placement game. Every time you place one of these ambassadors on the board, you're not just activating an action, you're actually having an effect on 4 different parts of the game. And that's why I'm coining this
4-dimensional worker placement.
I've certainly seen many games where when you're placing a worker, you're not just thinking about the action you're taking, there's a couple other things you have to take into account. So I think the best way to explain what this game is to flesh out what those 4 dimensions are. During this journey through the 4 dimensions, we're going to take a couple of side quests and explain other important parts of this game. But first, let's go into the most basic of things when you place these is the actions. So the first thing you're going to do is take one of your 4 workers and place it on the Senate floor. The Senate floor is divided into 2 halves, the left wing and the right wing, and there's significance to the different floors, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So this is probably a good time to dive into the actions and what they do. The first that I'm going to talk about is a blue lunar planet. Pretty simply, you're taking what I think is a warlock for whatever reason. I don't know what the theme is there, but you're taking your meeple and going up this planet track. Every time you get to a new planet, you're able to pick one of these alteration tokens. These alteration tokens will augment a future ambassador that you're placing. You simply put the alteration token on top of that ambassador, and it totally changes both the number and will give you some form of a bonus. Next up is the orange mining planet. There's 4 different crystal resources. All of them technically have varying degrees of value, and this is simply a track you move your miner up to gain the resources. Next is the purple nebulous plant. This is where all the different planetary beings hang out. What you're going to be doing here is grabbing tiles. These tiles give you a variety of bonuses, including being able to score points within a round. And now we have the yellow arid planet. This is the trader planet, and what you're doing here is paying resources and trading up to either better resources or more resources, depending on what level you're on. And last has been my favorite planet to date, and it's the green robotic planet. When you take this action, you pay resources and build structures, which is essentially giving you an immediate income as well as income after each round. You can also build these mega structures where you also pay resources, but then can score immediately on a particular criteria. So that's the planet. It's basically therefore gathering resources and scoring some extra points intermittently. And all these planets are multifunctional. They're doing the action that I just described, but there's also value to how many times you've gone to the planet, because each time you're essentially gaining a certain number of influence depending on what you did. And that influence relates to a couple different things. One is scoring goals, which we can dive into a little bit later. Basically, the higher the influence or the more times you visited that planet, it might qualify you for some points later on. The other thing is if you get high enough, you get these medals. And to understand those, let's look at the player board just for a second. Every time you get one of these medals, you put it on your player board in the top most available space. At the end of the game, you score the lowest amount of points that is available on the board. So more medals equals more endgame points. That encourages you a bit to spread your attention through multiple planets and not just focus in one spot. It's one of the friction points in this game where you're wanting to balance getting more medals and specializing in a planet that you think is going to be scored. Now we're moving on to the second dimension of decision that you're considering when you place one of your ambassadors, and that's voting. So to understand voting, first we have to understand our ambassador tokens. There's 2 different sides. There's one side with no value on it. It's essentially a coin, and that's for funding, which we'll talk about in a second. But the side that's relevant here is your voting side. So it shows an outline of your ambassador and a number. That's essentially the strength of your vote or the number of votes that you're placing. And what are you placing those votes for? Well, it's to pass a law. Each round there's a left-wing law and there's a right-wing law, and all of them relate to the scoring of a planet's influence, which we just talked about. At the end of each round, these votes are tallied up, and the side with the most votes passes the law or approves the goal to be scored. So you can imagine if your opponent's really high on one influence track and you're high on another, they're both about to be scored, you're going to want to take as many actions actions as you need to that are on the side of the law that you want to approve or on the side of the goal that you want to be scored. This is one half of what makes this game unique. And it's a really interesting twist to mid-game bonuses. Mid-game bonuses aren't new. Nearly all worker placement Euro games do something similarly. But this one, these goals aren't guaranteed, they're not acquired, they're voted on. And especially in a 3 and 4 player game, you really can't predict which one's going to come out on top. So there's definitely pressure to not only choose the voting side of your ambassador, but to also choose actions that are on the side of the law that you want to approve. And I'll say that it's a significant amount of points in the end. It really creates tension and mind share for the players each and every round. So you can't really set up shop and focus in on one strategy. Depending on what laws are flipped at the beginning of each round might determine how your round is going to take place. And the third dimension we're diving into is the aforementioned funding. So there's the funding side of your ambassador chip. When you play that, depending on the column that you're playing it in, is the project that you're voting to fund. And these projects, very simply, are in-game goals. They're related to influences on the individual planets, as well as the number of special missions you went on, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The first time I played this game, I wasn't thinking a ton about it until the 5th round when I realized that I wasn't making smart decisions to fund the planets that I needed to fund in order to score the maximum points. And that's where the game really started to click to me, and I turned to my wife and said, oh yeah, this is good. I really understand now the importance of not just choosing the right actions, but choosing the right actions in the right column, as well as passing the laws for the inter-round scoring. And this funding side also has a dual purpose. Each of them gives you a special mission token that you can place on your board. And when that's placed, that basically unlocks the potential of you using that space on your board as a special action. The way you do that is to acquire these spaceship tokens, and after you place your ambassador, if you have a spaceship token, you can place it on any of these actions. Some of these actions mirror exactly what's on the Senate board. Others are special and more powerful. The second part of that is there's this accreditation track on the left side of your board. You go up that from a number of ways, including there's a space on the Senate board that helps you go up that track as well. And you can't complete any of these missions unless your accreditation is high enough on that track. Just another kind of friction point on getting stuff done in this game, but it's really interesting. This accreditation track also has a secondary purpose, which is related to the fourth dimension of decision that you're going to be taking into account when you place these ambassadors. Because at the end of each round, each of these Senate floors will be tallied for a majority. And the player with the majority on each floor scores a number of points equal to their accreditation level. So if you're pretty high on that level and you're taking a 1 or 2 majorities, that definitely can add up over 5 rounds. So needless to say, there's a lot going on when you simply place an ambassador token. You're trying to figure out what action you want to do, and those actions are related to kind of inter-round scoring and resource gathering and such. You're also taking into account what law you want to pass so you can score that particular goal this round. And then on a longer term perspective, which absolutely snuck up on me when I was playing, is which project you're trying to fund. Because if they don't fund, you don't score that planet's influence that you've been working so hard on. And lastly, there's that area majority mechanic that I just described. The decisions are really rich and deep, and they're constantly changing based upon how another player is playing. So it's not that they're just blocking your actions, they could also be voting in an opposite direction than you. So for a Euro, I found that there's a pretty high player interaction in this game, which is a nice change. It's not just single player solitaire game that the person with the most points at the end wins. So another thing I want to mention about this game are the components. It's kind of a tale of two stories here. Anything related to the player and the player board and their pieces is wonderful. There's these double layer player boards that are great. Anytime I see dual layered, I am all in on them. The player bits are cool. There's little cute robot meeples that look great. The check marks on the double layer board is an awesome touch. And the ambassador tokens are like mini poker chips. It's overall really, really impressive production. The other side of that coin is there's a ton of punch cardboard. Nothing really special about the rest of the game. As you set up, you have to place a ton of it out on the board. There is a ton of setup as well relating to all of these different pieces. And that brings me to the next point. There are some bits trays, but there's not enough bits trays to take into account all the different bits. And there's no other form of organization in this game. As I flip to this picture of an open box, yeah, it's a complete mess. And there's a lot of things to set up. So this is a game that I'm absolutely going to look for an organizer. I mean, at $100 price point and it's a deluxe game, I'm actually really disappointed. I mean, at the very least, we should have gotten some sort of basic organization. So I guess we blame inflation. If we really wanted a decent organizer, we might have to spend 130 bucks or so, which I'll probably end up paying anyways if I want to get an organizer for this thing. All right, so now on to my totally subjective, mean nothing at all rankings. First, my crunchometer. This is how I'm measuring how brain burny this thing is, and it's a 4 out of 5. You know, Lacerda and On Mars is sitting up there at a 5 for me. This is definitely a worker placement Euro Plus game in my mind. Teaching it has been a little bit confusing. It's certainly not intuitive, especially when you have to explain that every time you're placing a worker, you're actually thinking about 4 different things. But that's not a bad thing. That's just a subjective observation on my part. And in fact, for me, the crunchier the better. The bling meter, I love deluxe games. I love the stupid Kickstarter editions that give me way too much crap. I love metal coins and double layer boards and all of that stuff. So that's why this is a ranking here. And this one just gets a 3.5 out of 5 for me here. Like I said, anything related to the player is great, which is frankly the most important. The rest of the production is okay. There's nothing else deluxeified outside of the player's experience. But the thing that really drags it down is no insert. I love inserts because they help me get games like this to the table quicker. And when I have to think about digging through 20 different bags to set the game up, it'll stop me from getting it off the shelf. And most importantly for me, the fun meter. How fun is this game? I'm calling it right now a 4 out of 5. Just so you know, I'm not a big believer in ranking games. Games tend to fall off for me after I get a certain number of plays in, but for right now, after a few plays, it's a 4. It does have high replayability. It has a really interesting design that's constantly augmented by what other players are doing, which really breathes life into a Euro for me. Once I kind of figure out the patterns, especially in a 2-player solitaire game, I become bored of them really quickly. And this, with the voting mechanic and the multi-dimensional placement, it's not getting old like those others as quickly. And due to that multi-dimensional nature in that worker placement, every turn feels rewarding. You're accomplishing progress on multiple fronts every single time you place a person. I will say the one thing that's kind of missing here is the combo-tastic nature that I love. I love games when one action turns to another, and you get these really big, satisfying turns. That's not at all this game. Final thoughts here are, it's a really great game. It has above average production, and parts of it are wonderful. I personally love the theme. I love the voting mechanics. I love the unique take on the worker placement here. I will say that I will probably only play this at 2 players. I might get it to the table on a game night at 4, but the vast majority of plays will be in 2. And while I think the game does a good job of blocking off spaces, you don't have that voting tension where you don't know where a law is going to pass or a project's going to fund. You can kind of do the math and understand, depending on what the other player is prioritizing, if they're going to pass a law or not, or fund a particular project. In the end, all that matters is this going to stay in my collection, and absolutely for now at least. I don't know that this will be a staple forever in my collection. However, will I get 10, 15, maybe even 20 plays out of it? I think absolutely I will. And for that reason, I'm going to give it the gorilla stamp of approval. And if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. This channel is absolutely in its infancy right now. I'm trying to push out as much content as I possibly can. I'm working really hard to get this thing off the ground, and you watching it was really appreciated. If you liked it and want to see more, feel free to subscribe, and I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Any feedback is welcome. Also, what other games are you interested that are coming up? That may help to direct where my attention goes. And with all that said,